Today on Better Book Club's tips for reading Wuthering Heights. In a poll I put out a couple of months ago, you chose Wuthering Heights as the next novel you wanted me to give you some tips on reading. So today's video is a response to that, and I've posted my next poll below. So if you'd like to participate in the poll this time, just click on the link below and let me know what classic novel you would like some tips on next. So for today, we're going to talk about Wuthering Heights. It's the only novel that Emily Bronte ever wrote, although she did write some poetry as well. And it was published just 1 year before she died at the age of 30 of tuberculosis. So it just makes you wonder what other great novels she might have had in her that we now don't have. But we do have Wuthering Heights. It's a really interesting, unusual novel. Emily, of course, is the sister of Charlotte Bronte, who's the author of Jane Eyre. And I would say that Jane Eyre is a little bit more of a traditional Gothic novel than Wuthering Heights is. When it came out, the critics had a very strong reaction to it. It was called savage, clumsy in construction, animal-like, but it's also over time been called ambitious, powerful, underappreciated, inventive, and brilliant. So Emily Bronte was born in 1818, and for the most part, she stayed home in a little town called Haworth in Yorkshire in England. You can actually visit the Bronte home today. It's a historical site, and I'll also put the link below for that if you're interested. And she had a little bit of experience away from home. She spent a small amount of time in Brussels and in Halifax. But really, when she wrote Wuthering Heights, she was writing about the setting and the atmosphere of the moors, the Yorkshire moors around her home. I'll also put a couple of links to some national parks in England today that will give you some visual sense of what this landscape is like, because the landscape really plays into the mysterious, dark, Gothic nature of this novel. Just to give you a little flavor for that, let me just read one paragraph from early in the book. In this case, the narrator is a neighbor who is coming to Wuthering Heights, the house, that's the name of the house, for the first time. And he says in his journal, he writes, "On that bleak hilltop, the earth was hard with a black frost, and the air made me shiver through every limb. Being unable to remove the chain, I jumped over, and running up the flagged causeway bordered with straggling gooseberry bushes, knocked vainly for admittance till my knuckles tingled and the dogs howled." So that gives you a little bit of the kind of dark, brooding flavor of this novel, although there are times also when she describes the moors in all of their beauty, in a sunnier, more pleasant season and time. So there are a few things that might make this novel a little bit of a challenging read for you. For me, the biggest one was just keeping track of the two families that Wuthering Heights is about. So there are two houses on the moors, and they're within walking distance of one another. And at Wuthering Heights is the Earnshaw family, and then at a house called Thrushcross Grange is the Linton family. And of course, because these families live close together, they intermarry. But not only is that confusing, it's also confusing because some of the names, the first names, are repeated in different generations. There are several names that sound very similar. So for example, there are, I think, 3 characters whose first name begins with H. And so it's a little hard to keep track of them. And then even more challenging, the story isn't really told in chronological order. And so keeping the generations straight is also challenging. So as with many novels, one thing you might want to do is kind of chart out, okay, here are the two houses, here are the families that live in them. Sometimes they kind of cross positions. There are some kind of complex relationships among them to keep track of. And so, it's helpful to write them down in a little chart and keep track that way. Another thing that's really interesting about this novel is understanding who the narrator is. So we have the new tenant of Thrushcross Grange, and we also have a servant named Ellen Dean, and she's in a position to be able to tell a story from the previous generation. So she has served both of these families at different times. She knows all of the key players very well. She's witnessed their family history, And she's going to retell much of their story to this newcomer who's renting Thrushcross Grange. It's kind of helpful to picture yourself as that character, as the audience, as somebody who is new to this town and who is being told a spooky, mysterious, passionate family story that he's very curious about because some of the players are still in the neighborhood. Think of yourself as the person who's being told this story, and I think that makes the read more enjoyable and exciting. This is also a great novel to read in the wintertime because there's a big snowstorm and the character who's being told the story gets caught in the storm and then he's sick in bed. And so if you're reading the novel during a stormy winter weekend, that's actually a really great correlation with what's happening in the novel. Sometimes readers struggle with the 19th century prose, and it's true that there are some long, kind of complicated, convoluted sentences or things, the pacing of things in this novel, as is true with 19th century novels in general, is different from the pacing we get in a 21st century novel. But if you're reading Wuthering Heights, you already know that. One thing I found really interesting about it is that unlike some novels of its time, it really starts, it just jumps right into the action. It doesn't take a whole long time to set the scene and the characters and build up to it. So that's actually an encouraging thing about this novel, is that it's just going to drop you right in the middle of the action and get going right away. Another thing that's helpful to know is that this is not a romance in the sense of a Jane Austen novel. So it's not Pride and Prejudice. It's not a precursor to our rom-coms, which I find when I read Austen, it's really surprising how many of the tropes that we have in our romantic comedies today can be traced back to Austen and arguably further. This is not that book. So it is a love story, but it's not a romantic comedy. So think of it as romantic in the Gothic sense. It's dark, it's mysterious, it's passionate. So it's just helpful to have a little bit of an expectation about what kind of a novel it is so that you're not expecting it to do something it's not going to do. Finally, I'll just share with you something that I learned as I was putting this video together. I looked up the word wuthering. I had never really thought much about what it might mean, but it actually means a wind that's blowing very strongly, or a place that's really windswept. And so, of course, you can picture a house called Wuthering Heights up on the hill in the moors, just being battered by the wind. So I hope you'll give Wuthering Heights a try, maybe suggest it to your book club. This would be a great book club read because it's not super long, but I think there's a lot to really dig into in conversation. I hope you'll respond to the poll below, and I'll be back soon with another episode of Better Book Clubs.